The human quest for evolution is entirely their own, and our eternal souls are created by no one but ourselves. On its surface, 2001: A Space Odyssey is telling us a story about extraterrestrials guiding the evolution of human beings. At its deepest level, the level of Kubrick's intention, this movie is telling us that we have no one to assist in that evolution but ourselves. Ragnarok and revolutionize. The very meaninglessness of life forces man to create his own meaning. If it can be written or thought, it can be filmed. Stanley Kubrick. The hidden meanings of 2001: A Space Odyssey. The hidden meanings within Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey have been studied, discussed, and debated ever since its release in the year 1968. With more than 50 years as an audience under our belt, we still haven't come to an acceptable consensus as to what the film is really trying to say. I think that if this film had a voice of its own, it would be telling us that that was its exact intention. The true meaning is intentionally withheld by the director for the rare few with the will and the capacity to understand it. In 2001, the surface-level narrative is so beautifully executed, many viewers never give it any deeper meanings or even a second thought. There is hardly a chance to notice them while watching the film considering the Academy Award-winning visual effects. It seems the best way to find the key to unlock this film lays in reflecting upon the experience as a whole and not trying to extrapolate meanings from the individual scenes. This can be done, but unlocking the meaning of the individual scenes only becomes possible when you have the key to do so. This key is understanding the intentions of the director. Once we understand the context, we can understand the finished product. When a director like Stanley Kubrick makes a film, it is not simply because they have a passion for filmmaking, but also, like any artist, they have something important to say. Anyone can entertain, anyone can teach, but only a truly creative mind can impart felt knowledge. What do you feel when you watch this film? As we reflect upon how we feel, we have many abstract thoughts floating through our minds that we are trying to filter down into coherent thoughts. This is the process of understanding, and it separates the wheat from the chaff. If our will is strong, we continue our search for truth until the answer is found. If we are weak, our ego will replace the truth with the most convenient answer our mind can handle. When critics review this film, they tend to do so backwards. They don't come from a place of trying to understand the overall intentions of the director, and instead, they focus on the particulars. If we split the Mona Lisa into a dozen pieces, it ceases to be the Mona Lisa and becomes a dozen different paintings. All in the same style, theme, and painted with the same color palette, of course, but not understood completely until they become whole again. We can say that the monolith represents the abstract concept of God, but do we really understand what that means? Do we have to be well-versed in Nietzsche to understand the personal evolution of Dave Bowman? Are we self-aware enough to continue our search for understanding, or are we willing to submit and attach ourselves to the coattails of those who came before us? Self-awareness is what unlocks the doors of perception. We become more aware, and we see things in different ways. Each viewing of 2001: A Space Odyssey opens up new levels of understanding, but it all begins with that first time we watch it. If the film's first viewing doesn't resonate, there won't be a second viewing. If a film doesn't have an interesting and intriguing surface narrative, no one will ever give it a second look.
I can feel it. I can feel it.
What is the surface narrative? The idea of sky gods guiding the evolution of mankind has become increasingly popular in recent decades. Truth be told, sci-fi authors and independent researchers had been studying ancient astronaut theory long before Ancient Aliens ever appeared on the History Channel. Naturally pushing boundaries, Stanley Kubrick was a pioneer and took the idea of ancient astronauts even a step further than actual physical beings. They could have emerged from the chrysalis of matter, transformed into beings of pure energy and spirit. Their potentialities would be limitless, and their intelligence ungraspable by humans. These entities might be aware of everything that occurs throughout the cosmos. They might not be limited by the speed of light, and their presence could penetrate to the farthest corners of the universe. They might possess complete mastery over matter and energy, and in their final evolutionary stage, they might develop into an integrated collective immortal consciousness. The surface narrative of 2001: A Space Odyssey follows the evolution of mankind from apes, through human beings, to the next and unknown level of being. If we have some knowledge of the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, our ego may find gratification in our discovery of the parallel themes between the Übermensch and Kubrick's Star Child. If we believe that this was Kubrick's primary message in 2001, we are doing ourselves a great disservice. That would be reducing the work to a simulacrum of an already well-established idea. Kubrick is not imitating Nietzsche. It is more correct to say that both carried the same esoteric knowledge regarding the evolution of consciousness. Therefore, the works created by each are sure to have similar underlying themes and patterns. This is because we are following along with the evolution of consciousness, not just the physical evolution of human beings. And that is an archetypal journey and a process passed down in secret since the dawn of man. The tool that guides this evolution in 2001 is the monolith. The surface narrative implies, but never directly states, that this process is guided by extraterrestrial aliens. The closest we get to this in exposition is Floyd's message played as Bowman is shutting down the brain of the HAL 9000 computer.
18 months ago, the first evidence of intelligent life off the Earth was discovered.
So, the surface narrative of 2001 is aliens guiding human evolution through the means of the monolith. The novelization of the movie, which was written by sci-fi author Arthur C. Clarke, more directly supports this interpretation, and even describes the monolith as showing images to the apes teaching them to hunt. If we think the symbolism of this film goes no deeper, we need only look to the words of Stanley Kubrick himself. You're free to speculate as you wish about the philosophical and allegorical meaning of the film, as such speculation is one indication that it has succeeded in gripping the audience at a deep level. But I don't want to spell out a verbal roadmap for 2001 that every viewer will feel obligated to pursue or else fear he's missed the point. What is the hidden meaning of the monolith? Nietzsche's three stages of human evolution are ape, man, and Superman. This pattern does fit in directly with what we see in the surface narratives of 2001: A Space Odyssey. We see apes, we see men, and then we see the Star Child floating above the rest. Yes, the two stories fit the same pattern, but this is only the ends. We need a means to get there. The monolith is the means for evolution in 2001, and the end is evolution to a higher level. If we are saying that the surface level narrative of this film is the monolith bringing forth a higher form of physical evolution, this would imply that the hidden meaning of it is the monolith bringing forth a higher level of mental or spiritual evolution. If this is the intention of the director, then the monolith must be a symbol for something other than an alien device transmitting signals to apes. If we are exploring the idea of the monolith being a representation of God as an abstract concept, then the specific dimensions of the monolith could come into play here. It is well known that numbers, numerology, and mathematics play into many esoteric religious traditions. The idea of God as an abstract concept must involve mathematics, as this is the core of every esoteric tradition. Reason being is that ultimately the only thing that can help us better understand what physically created our material selves is to measure the creation in which we live. I'm not sure we can even consider this image to be relegated to esoteric ideas anymore. The golden ratio is older than evidence of written word. Every living thing is modeled off its image. The nautilus shell, the ratio between the sizes of the bones in our body, the way that flowers and plants grow, evidence of the golden ratio is all around us. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but the point is that if the monolith represented the abstract concept of God, then it should fit the dimensions of the golden rectangle. This is not true, however, and the monolith has dimensions of 1 to the first, 2 to the second, by 3 to the third, or 1 by 4 by 9, which is closer to a widescreen television than a golden rectangle. This could be especially significant if we consider the words of Arthur C. Clarke in the novelization, which described the monolith as an advanced television teaching machine. Rob Ager from collativeLearning.com has several YouTube videos breaking down the monolith in 2001. His theory, as much as he avoids outright saying it, is that the monolith represents a movie screen, or the movie screen. I'm tempted to believe that sometimes Rob Ager is suggesting that the monolith represents the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey itself, but of what that means to him personally, I'm not exactly sure. It could mean that the monolith is a gateway between the characters in the movie and the audience itself, or it could mean that the movie is self-aware and capable of seeing itself at any point in its own timeline. There's much evidence within the film to support the idea of it being self-aware. We have several instances of apes looking directly at the camera, the jaguar's eyes looking directly at us, the photographer seeming to take a picture of the audience and not the two guys in front of him, the obvious reflection of the camera crew in Bowman's space helmet. The list goes on. My question is that why are all of these things so obvious, but never attributed by viewers to the movie being self-aware? I think the answer is only 90 degrees away. Planetary alignments and the monolith. We see the monolith 4 different times in 2001, and in each occurrence we have some type of alignment happening in conjunction with its appearance. In its first occurrence, after the monolith appears outside the Cave of the Apes, we see a shot of the sun rising above the monolith underneath a crescent moon. The Vesica Pisces here, seen in the reflection of the sun and half in the shape of the moon, should not be ignored. The second is more subtle. The sun touches the monolith as a lens flare aligns with its light source. I believe this is because we don't see in the film the scene where the monolith is actually discovered. I'd say on Earth, but I guess it would have to be unmooned. If we were to see a planetary alignment, that is when it would have happened. The third occurrence of the monolith is after Bowman defeats the HAL 9000 and returns to the pod to seek out the monolith and the signal. This alignment is a callback to the first alignment, as well as the opening scene of the movie, when Thus Spoke Zarathustra is played. These shots are all beautiful and pleasing to the eye, but are all completely impossible as far as the reality we understand it goes. The opening credits of the film depict an eclipse, but the spheres are orbiting at a 90-degree angle to the way an eclipse actually happens. The entire process is turned at a right angle to the way we would naturally perceive it. If the opening credits were reality, the sun would be orbiting around the prime meridian and not the equator. This is the way these shots would look in reality. But space is beyond the veil of illusion, and the physical laws as we know them don't apply. We'll elaborate more on the concept of the veil of illusion shortly. The fourth occurrence of the monolith is in Bowman's zoo enclosure after the Stargate sequence. This final alignment is again subtle, like the second one. There are no planets to align with in a room without windows. The first camera shot from outside the room, where the wall behind Bowman had to be removed to make the shot. The bed in which he was lying, as well as Bowman himself, align in front of the camera. It is subtle, but the monolith also moves closer to Bowman, closer than it was in the previous shot. This is the scene which culminates with Bowman becoming the Star Child and transcending reality as we know it. When we pass through the veil of illusion, we enter the spiritual realm, where physical laws as we know them don't apply. This would be something like where we go when we astral project, if you get down with that sort of thing, or like taking a trip to the fourth dimension. I understand that concept can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, so it's best to reduce things to terms like subtle and dense. Our physical reality, which exists in 3 dimensions, is dense, and the intangible mental realms, or higher dimensions, are subtle. The scene right before the last appearance of the monolith is a direct callback from the point in the film where we break the veil, which is the transition between the ape throwing the bone in the air and the satellite floating in space. Hal, are you in there?
Of course I am. Sorry about this. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made.
Hal, come on, hurry up. You've been in there for an hour.
Just a moment. Just a moment. Just a moment. Just a moment.
Hal, seriously.
Just a moment. Just a moment. Just a moment. Just a moment. This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize.
Shifting Perspectives, Part 1. If human evolution begins on Earth, then 2001 A Space Odyssey is telling us that the next phase of evolution begins when we enter the unknown of space. Remember, this film came out in 1968, and we still had not yet traveled to the moon. This is not calling into question the alleged moon landing, or the recent commercial space flights by SpaceX and Virgin Galactic only being able to reach the highest level of the atmosphere but not actually cross into the vacuum of space. But the question is legitimate to consider. Crossing into the vacuum of space is highly symbolic, and it represents the point in which we are so far away from the Earth that nothing that exists on Earth can continue to exist. If we look to Christian symbolism, this would represent the firmament written about in the book of Genesis. If we look to esoteric traditions, this boundary is referred to as the veil of illusion. This is the boundary of physical reality, and in crossing it, we enter to the higher vibrational reality, which is just one piece of an infinitely refracted mirror image. Back to the movie. The way that 2001 symbolizes the break through the veil is when we, the audience, leave the Earth and enter space. As said, crossing into the non-physical realm is breaking into a mirrored image of our current reality. Stanley Kubrick communicates this shift to us by making us question the continuity of the image he shows to us. Space, in 2001, symbolizes a mental realm that is entirely of our own creation, and this is why continuity, the rotation of things in space, the way they are lit, and the changing and inconsistent gravity doesn't matter. This is why no living thing but man exists in space. What happens when we see the jump cut of the bone to satellite? It could have easily been cut to keep the satellite near the same rotation as the bone, but instead it appears as if its rotation completely flips in reverse. What happens when Bowman knocks his wine glass off the table later in the movie? The rotation of the cup seems to flip as it cuts to the shot of the glass about to shatter. This seems like a deliberate sign from Kubrick that we are crossing into the next level beyond the spiritual realm, which esoterically would be the realm in which God exists, and we are completely incapable of understanding or even perceiving. But why is it important to convey that reality is flipping over to mirror itself? Seemingly, it is to convey the message that the same pattern is iterating itself in a different fashion. The journey from ape to man is a different iteration of the same pattern that the journey from man to Starchild is. On the surface level, this is the same as well, but is conveyed in different ways. The Dawn of Man sequence has no dialogue, so we are left to see and feel the evolution of the apes. The rest of the film fits with the more recognizable narrative of the hero's journey. This is a timeless story that we are all able to relate with, whether the relation is subconscious or something that we are aware of more deeply. Let's venture a little bit deeper into this pattern. What is the pattern? The hero's journey is expressed in the most memorable mythology from the collective of our human memory. The 12 Labors of Hercules, stories in the Bible, the tales of King Arthur and Camelot, the Lord of the Rings, the original Star Wars. These are all iterations of the hero's journey pattern, which is the esoteric symbol for the journey from a mindless animal to a self-actualized immortal soul. It is the process of transcending the need to take in energy in order to exist and becoming a being that actually creates more energy than it requires to sustain itself. Essentially, This makes the hero into its own sun, or a source of energy unto itself. This is why, symbolically, all the heroes from mythology make their way into constellations of stars in the sky. All the memorable stories told through generations have the same basic pattern and are only adapted for each cultural framework. They all involve a hero, male or female, introduced into an idyllic setting, who then experiences some kind of fall or great loss which sends them on their journey. The journey usually consists of fantastical creatures or situations, travel to high mountains, hidden valleys, or even to the depths of hell itself. After the climax of the story, we see the change in the hero, facilitated by their personal quest, and we reflect upon their newfound self-awareness. These stories are filled with symbolism, as their intention is for us to be able to relate with the struggles of the heroes to the trials and tribulations we face in our own lives. We have to use our imagination here. We have to understand that symbolism is conveyed in unrealistic things that don't actually exist in our reality. The dragons and monsters, and HAL 9000s, of mythology are personifications of the problems we face in the real world. So if we apply this knowledge to 2001, we should at least give ourselves a solid footing for finding the hidden meanings of the film. When something doesn't make sense to an audience, they do one of two things. Either they shrug off the things they don't understand and continue following the surface narrative, or they stop to take a second look. 2001 is the type of film that upon taking a second look, we will need to take a third look, and so on and so forth until the entirety of reality collapses in on itself. So what are the things in 2001 that make us take a second look? For me, personally, knowing the meticulous nature of Stanley Kubrick makes many of the continuity errors in 2001 something that causes me to take a second look. These errors start from the very beginning, as we discussed earlier, regarding the planetary alignments being rotated 90 degrees. They continue with the placement of the sun in the sky during the different shots in the Dawn of Man sequence, which we could always chalk up to not knowing the exact passage of time between cuts. This explanation is hard to stand by if we consider the way the sun and the moon suddenly align with the monolith, seemingly directly after the apes first observe the monolith just after dawn. The continuity errors continue once we arrive in space. The satellites waltz across the screen, changing direction and speed with every cut. Of course, the first few satellites are all different. Although we never see two at a time on screen, the awkward cuts are pretty unsettling. These can all be explained, but once we see the shuttle moving towards the space station, there is another mirror flip that can't be. The shuttle begins its approach to the space station, which is slowly rotating clockwise. When we cut to the next shot, and from here on out, the shuttle is still approaching from the same direction, yet the space station is now rotating counterclockwise. Another example of mirror images happens when we watch pools jogging through the centrifuge. It shifts to a mirror image of itself, but it's easy to miss considering the cuts flipping our view from the front and back of pool inside of it. So we have a hero's journey pattern, and our perspective seems to be continuously shifted by 90 degrees or completely flipped into a mirror image. This shift in perspective comes most prominently at the final part of the pattern, when the hero achieves their goal and gains awareness. This shift is not an ending, but a new beginning. Even if we only have short glimpses of a timeline within a film, its events are assumed to continue on. In 2001, this pattern completes itself more than once, the first time being the first 20 minutes of the film or so. The film begins with silence and a black screen. This is the void before creation, and I would argue that this is actually the first appearance of the monolith, if we imagine that the monolith is actually the movie screen itself. I believe one of the keys to understanding the monolith is the understanding the correspondence between it and the void itself. As the apes later confront the monolith, it is a callback to the original void at the beginning of time. First was no thing, and then the no thing became something, becoming aware and beginning to vibrate with delight. So begins the Ligeti piece heard over the black screen. After the opening credits, we are introduced to a group of apes foraging for food alongside of other wildlife, grooming each other, and then drinking at the watering hole. This is their primal state, their idyllic state, corresponding to the void at the beginning of time. From here we begin. The pattern starts at its birth, in the primal untouched state. Then the hero experiences some loss, and that begins their quest. towards some type of recourse to solve their problem. In the case of the apes, this loss is experienced first with the leopard killing one of their tribe, the general threat of the harsh terrain itself, and then most prominently when a rival group of apes drives the first group away from their watering hole. After the loss of the watering hole, things seem very bleak for the first group of apes. They cower in their cave at night, listening to the ominous sounds of predators in the distance. We expect to see the apes awaken to some new tragedy, but enter the monolith to begin their journey to self-awareness. The apes, learning to hunt, now become carnivores, feeding on the other animals after their discovery of tools. This is the second step of the pattern, the rise after the fall. This is where our hero gains the tools necessary to defeat his foes. The symbolic end to this journey, the final step of the pattern, is the resolution and the beginning of the next pattern. After the apes kill the rival tribe's leader and take back their watering hole, the ape, known in the novel as Moonwatcher, throws his bone weapon into the air. Cut to several million years later, we see the highest of current human technology, as well as the greatest film cut in history. Shifting Perspectives, Part 2. As the enlightened minds understand, all things are in constant motion and are never standing still. This is why we are taught not to judge things for what they are, but to observe what they are becoming. We are born into this life as raw and infinite potential. We live out our purpose, and then we die the completed version of ourselves. If we isolate any given moment of our life, it is impossible to judge what we are unless we consider the entirety of our lives leading up to that moment. In 2001, we can see this process carried out in regards to the entirety of the human race. We were born into consciousness when apes evolved into human beings, creating a physical vehicle in 3 dimensions for our consciousness to inhabit. We then live and evolve as human beings until our physical body is no longer necessary as a vehicle for consciousness, and our physical bodies die and fade away. 2001 isn't just an allegory for the evolution of human beings, it is an allegory for the evolution of consciousness itself. It is a journey of consciousness through the birth, life, and death of humanity. But the universe is infinite and never-ending, as is consciousness itself. Consciousness does not end with the death of human beings as a species. It continues on, rising to a higher level each time the pattern is completed. From our perspective on Earth, this seems incredibly more finite. We watch our fellow human beings expire and fade away. Everything in our reality seems finite and disappears with time. Entropy tells us that the universe will continue expanding until eventually it is nothing more than a field of equally separated particles continuing to expand outwards. There is no physical evidence in this reality that anything other than the material actually exists. So how can the universe, how can all of creation be infinite when our observable reality seems distinctly finite? How does a finite individual exist in an infinite reality? Understanding this fact is contingent on the perspective shift that Stanley Kubrick is trying to convey to us in 2001. Imagining in our minds a universe that is completely void of any creation is a difficult task. The concept of nothing is easy to understand, but no thing is a concept that tears at the mind. Thinking of the universe as an infinitely vast empty space induces one of the most frightening and hollow feelings I've ever felt. The absolute horror regarding the vacuum of space, that void, is constantly at the foreground of the surface narrative in 2001: A Space Odyssey. That surface narrative of 2001 is a journey outward to the furthest limits of our imagination. If we take the mirror image of this, then the hidden meaning of 2001 must represent the journey inward. It must represent human beings not looking out, but instead looking inside themselves. One of the most important themes that is missed in this film is that it is entirely symbolic of the journey into the infinite universe inside of every conscious human being. Compared to the idea that the inside of us is infinite, the idea of the universe expanding outward infinitely is much easier to fathom. Also true is that compared to the horror of the void in space, the crippling fear of looking inside ourselves is practically impossible to conceptualize, let alone actually do. For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a mirror. James chapter 1 verse 23. The interpretation of this verse in the Christian Bible is as follows. In the dense material world, we hear, which is symbolic of a sensory experience, the word, which is symbolic of creation, with our physical bodies. Simply stated, we experience creation with our dense physical body. Therefore, conversely, we experience the subtle, spiritual realm with our conscious, non-physical mind. This is the doer, the one who actively overcomes his ego and sees the world for what it truly is. The dense, material 3D world is constantly expanding outward, and the subtle, spiritual realm is actually collapsing inward, completely opposite from the way our bodies perceive it. So how can we put aside our ego and begin to conceptualize something infinitely collapsing inward upon itself? Understanding the void within. At times, 2001: A Space Odyssey is genuinely scary. The surface narrative of the movie is steadily moving mankind further and further outwards into unknown territory. Naturally, at times, this journey is going to fly out of control. We aren't shown all the failures and loss of life probably caused by the progression of technology, but we should feel terrified at the sight of Poole's lifeless body floating away in space. We should be on the edge of our seat when Bowman takes a jump through open space without a tether. It could be said that Bowman's journey through the Stargate is a continuation of this outward journey, but the mirror of this is an in-your-face metaphor of the journey deep inside ourselves, which is as infinite and never-ending as the journey into the depths of space. If we can conceptualize something being infinitely big, we must also be able to conceptualize something being infinitely small, and mathematics should be our starting point here. If we were able to measure distance into space, we could represent this mathematically with an irrational number. If we think of something like pi, whose digits never end, we can begin to conceptualize the concept of infinity. Although the numbers continue on into infinity, what is ambiguous is whether or not this is making the number itself actually increasingly larger or increasingly smaller. The coastline paradox. When we measure the distance of something, we can only be accurate according to the context of the measurement we are using. This is easily expressed in the idea of the coastline paradox. To sum up, the measurement of the perimeter of something actually becomes larger as your measurement of distance becomes smaller. Check out this image of the coastline paradox by sketchplanations.net. The rate at which length increases with scale is the fractal dimension. Have you ever watched a fractal video on the internet? This is the mathematical expression of that very concept. We see ourselves descending into something, yet it is indistinguishable as to whether or not things are getting bigger or smaller. Sounds something like the Stargate, doesn't it? Maybe it doesn't matter whether or not things are increasing or decreasing in size. Maybe it's impossible to know because our perspective is constantly changing. Maybe we're getting bigger or smaller too. What I do know is that once you accept that the hidden message of 2001: A Space Odyssey is the journey within and not the journey without, then the images shown after the Stargate sequence are showing things on a microscopic level at the beginning of creation. We have a new heaven, a new earth, and then the dawn of the star child. We have all these images that look like cellular life more than they look like a universe being born. This is the pattern of our evolution: birth, life, and death. Consciousness remains, only its specific iteration changes. Just as the fractal continues, so do the iterations of consciousness. Just as the only thing alive in the void of space in 2001 are human beings, the only thing responsible for our evolution is ourselves. God is indeed an abstract concept, and the monolith is indeed a symbol of God. God is a symbol for self-awareness, and therefore man perceives the monolith as a movie screen, because we are in fact watching ourselves, and God is asleep at the wheel. This idea is really going to stretch the religious and atheistic minds alike. There is a God. There is a pattern in which all other things are created. There is an unmoved mover, and it encompasses all things. Atheists deny its existence for good reason, because there is no God who has direct effect on the material world. Religious people think God has some effect in the natural world, yet refute this by not being able to rationalize the contradictions their religious doctrines have created for themselves. Any organized religion that believes in one God will tell you that the God of their religion is omnipotent, and omnipresent. This would mean that they know and see all things. This would mean that all things are predetermined, because if God were all-knowing, they would also have to know the future as well as the past. So even though that eliminates free will, it still fits in line with most religious doctrines. If we use logic, there is a key point we are missing in this religious view on God. If God truly knows all things, meaning the entirety of the past and the future, then there is nothing new to learn. There is no reason to think if we know all things. I mean, there's literally no reason to think. Understanding this idea helps us understand that reason is a function of human consciousness. God does not think. He has no need to think. He knows all things. God is asleep, and we are all a part of his eternal dream. The hidden meaning of 2001 is that we, not God, not aliens, not anything else, guide our own evolution. It's us versus the void, and with nothing but our own bootstraps to move us forward. As Einstein once said, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of all that exists, but not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind." God exists. God is the pattern. We are the manifestation. If we want to know God, then we must create our own soul. This is the true birth, the birth of spirit, the birth of the star child. Ragnarok and revolutionize.